A question that I am constantly asked by both sides of the equation, unfaithful and betrayed, is, Samuel, is it worth it? Like, all this pain, all this hurt, the reminders, the triggers, the anger, the rage, the fighting, the expensive nature of recovery, is it worth it? Is it worth it for us to go through this? Is it worth it for me to try and get over the addiction or the infidelity? Is it worth it for me to try and get over the bitterness and the resentment in my heart? This is a constant question that continues to be at the forefront, I think, of the front lines of recovery, which is, when we get to the other side, will this all be worth it? The answer to that question, I think, is a resounding yes, even if you are not able to see your marriage restored. And I'll come back to that. But I'll tell you, it hurts like hell. I mean, the process of restoration, as someone who's gone through it, and I think is pretty in touch with the emotional flogging that recovery can feel like at times, it's worth it. The relationship that I have with Samantha, the marriage that I have, the family that I have, is absolutely worth the trauma or the field of trauma that I had to war through with a machete. I mean, I can itemize it all out for you, from childhood origin issues to resentment and bitterness to unmet needs to feeling rejected to incredible amounts of insecurity to Samantha having to forgive and the field upon field of forgiveness that she had to plow, the anger, the betrayal. I don't say this a lot, but Samantha had a double betrayal. I mean, she was betrayed by someone who was an extremely close friend of hers, who was my affair partner, but also by me. That compounds things very significantly. If you're an unfaithful spouse and you had an affair with one of your spouse's really close friends, I will tell you, in not a clinical form, but in a just down-to-earth, safe place message, it's a double betrayal. It was incredibly difficult for Samantha to forgive her close friend, and at times it was even more difficult to forgive her than to forgive me. So it's very real. It's very challenging to have to war through something like that. So let me work through a couple of scenarios with you. Number one, man, is it worth it when your spouse is open to restoration? Well, absolutely, and that's the easiest one. If they're open to it, then you owe it to yourself. You owe it to maybe your family if there's children. You owe it to the fact that you can't control the future. You don't know what the future is going to be like. You don't know what life is going to look like in 4, 5, 10 years. So you absolutely should give it a shot. You just don't know. I mean, again, Samantha looks at me now compared to how I was, and I have changed tremendously. If I can change, I promise you, your spouse can change. I promise you that you can change. But you owe it to yourself to give it a shot and see what the future can be like. You just don't know based upon right now. Now, the next scenario is your spouse may be communicating that they're not open to restoration, but yet they may be open to doing some form of recovery work. And I will tell you, it is worth it to pursue recovery, even if you have to say something to them like, listen, I know it's probably over. I know that you may not want to save the marriage. That's fine. Let's do some recovery work so that we can co-parent. Let's do some recovery work so that we can simply not hate each other. Let's do some recovery work so we both can move on from this chapter in our lives with a healthy transition. Because how you leave one thing determines how you'll enter into another. How you leave one marriage determines at some level how you'll enter into the next marriage. And so I think even though they may be saying that they're resistant to restoration, but yet they may be open to doing some recovery work, I would absolutely do it. And incidentally, I will tell you, if I had to put a number on it, I'll tell you that about 60 to 70% of the time, though they may say, yeah, I'm not open to restoration, but if they'll do some recovery work, a lot of times they will actually change and they will turn towards you, and you will be amazed at the fact that they actually become open to restoration. The third scenario is probably one of the most difficult, which is your spouse is not willing to do work, but yet you're tasked with the opportunity to either put your pain and your hurt and your trauma in a box and lock it away, or do some recovery work on your own to try and heal from the pain and the trauma that you've been put through. And I'll tell you, it's worth it to work through that trauma. It's worth it to spend whatever you need to spend, to borrow money if you need to, but to get some very expert-driven recovery work for your trauma. Trauma changes us, and you have the opportunity to get healed. Just 2 weeks ago, and I want to end with this story. It's a little bit humorous, but at the time it was incredibly painful, is that I coach my son's Little League team, and they're 11, and a mom was upset about lack of playing time with their son. Their son is a challenging individual, that's all I'm going to say. So we had a conversation, my assistant coach and myself and the mom. And I will tell you, I don't know that I've ever been talked to with that form of aggression in 40 some odd years of life, other than maybe a couple of fist fights I've gotten into and some really knockdown, drag-out fights with Samantha. And she was losing her mind to the point where she was shaking and yelling. I looked at my assistant coach with these eyes like, are you believing what's happening? And here's what I was able to find out from a lot of different sources or what have you, but it's when we're yelling at people, a lot of times we're not yelling at them, we're yelling at our spouse, at our traumatic experience, at our unhealed pain, at our unhealed hurt. We're taking it out on this person, and that's what she was doing. I don't think there's anything in her that really wanted to act like that, but the trauma, the pain, the unhealed hurt inside of her was coming out. And I promise you, going through this level of trauma and crisis, if you don't get the help that you need, if you don't venture out into these traumatic places of hurt and pain and just raw trauma, you're going to try and box up this pain, and it's going to find a way out. And if you don't see this pain healed and transformed, I promise you, you're going to be transmitting it. And you may be transmitting it to a Little League coach one day, making a real big scene because you didn't get the healing that you needed.